Professor Smart, I want to talk a little bit about methodology for a moment. Your methodology in looking at expenses was to look at expenses that supported rents, correct?
Yes.
And when we get to the post 1945 expenses, Mr. Hutchings testified, and I think you disagree with him. He said that he didn't think there was sufficient granularity of data in the public accounts after 1945 to be of sufficient assistance to him in his matching analysis at looking for expenses that relate to supporting, regulating, or collecting relevant resource revenues. Do you remember that? You understand that's his position?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that if one, being an economist, were to employ Mr. Hutchings' rules for inclusion of expenses as used in his methodology, which methodology is different than yours, I appreciate that, that he could be correct that there was not sufficient granularity to sort out the expenses in the public accounts of Ontario after 1945? Would you agree with that?
I think it could be possible.
Thank you. Now, in your testimony the other day, you had indicated that the percentage that Mr. Hutchings used of 31.9% on a go-forward basis after 1945, I think you had indicated that it would have been more, maybe, I don't want to be unfair, so I'm going to try and paraphrase what you said. It would be more accurate to use the last 10 years because there was an upward trend and it should be about 45%. Do you remember that?
Not exactly what I said. I did say all those words, but with a slightly different intent.
Okay, so what I have in my notes in front of me, which I took a printout of the testimony. I don't even know what day it is, but let me ask you if you remember these words. And because of the volatility, that's the volatility of the ratio of expenses to revenues, the annual variability in that share in his own data, it does not seem reasonable to make that assumption of a constant share thereafter. Moreover, it's not purely random variation from year to year. The expenses were already rising as a proportion of revenues in the years after World War I up to the end of World War II from 1919 to 1945. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
And I'm going to suggest to you that it is not a fair statement to say that expenses were already rising in a proportion to the revenues in the years between 1919 to 1945 and that you were mistaken. Would you agree?
I don't agree that I was mistaken.
Let's take a look at tab 28. Now there's two documents at tab 28. The first is an excerpt of a table 15.c that was prepared by Council for Ontario and put to Mr. Hutchings during his cross-examination, part of Exhibit H.1. And what Ontario lawyers had done is they went to Mr. Hutchings' work papers, perhaps with your assistance, I don't know, and came up with a list from his work papers, table 15.c, and then in brackets 9. Are you familiar with this list? Have you seen it
No, I
before?
wasn't involved in the preparation of the document you're showing me now, and I haven't seen it before, but the numbers look familiar from the work papers.
Okay, so for the purpose of these discussions, I'm going to ask you to assume that the numbers are correct
Will do.
without asking you to defend them or challenge them. Now, if these numbers are correct, what I see, sorry, maybe we should go to page 85 of the compendium. Now, all I've done is I've taken the data from that chart and I've graphed it so that one can sort of see the ratio of expenses to revenues rising or falling between 1919 and 1945. And would you agree with me that this graph demonstrates, and we could just go to year by year if you wanted to instead, but what it demonstrates is that there was a rise to about 1937, and then it dropped. Then it went up again in about 1940. Then it dropped in 41, dropped in 42, came down in 43, and then from 43 to 45 went up. Would you agree with that?
Yes, there's volatility, as I said in my testimony that you're quoting.
Right. And in one sense, it's, I guess, fair to say that from the low points of just over 10% in around 1923 or 1918 or so, there was the amount, the percentage in 1923 is a lot lower than the percentages from 37 to 45, but the other side of the graph shows that the percentages were a lot higher from 1898 to 1917 or so. Right, they're all over the place is the point. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
I'm going to suggest to you that there isn't a discernible trend in the 10 years prior to 1945. Would you agree with that?
I haven't examined, I can now, but I have not examined the trend in the prior 10 years. In my testimony, I spoke to the trend from 1919 through 1945.
So how would you describe the trend from 1898 to 1945?
I would say there are multiple different trends over that period.
Okay. And if you're trying to come up with an average that in economics, the more data points you have, the better. Is that true?
Not in general, no.
Would you agree with me that the ratio of expenses in 1927 is lower than 1903 to 1917?
I believe so.
Would you agree with me that the ratio of expenses for the period 1903 to 1908 was higher than 1918 to 1933?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that in the last decade prior to 1945 shows no trend of rising expense ratio, but that it varies seemingly from year to year?
Yes.
Would you also agree to me that what might seem like a trend in your analysis of trends and rising ratios could simply be a mathematical result of Mr. Hutchings' conservative assumptions about what expenses to include?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Well, in the years just prior to 1945, I understand that Mr. Hutchins included all of Baker's basic organization, and that doing that was a conservative measure on his part that has the effect of inflating the expense ratio. So that's a statement I've made, and do you know if that's true or not?
I'm afraid I don't. I haven't reviewed the work papers in sufficient detail to know if he included basic organization in the years up to 1945.
Okay. Let's go with a hypothetical. If indeed Mr. Hutchins included in a large number of expenses in the years prior to 1945 that increased the expenses, then if there is a higher ratio in those years, it could be an effect of the assumption, the increased expenses he was taking. Wouldn't you agree?
The ratio that he reports for 1945 will reflect the assumptions he made, even if those assumptions are inconsistent with the assumptions he would make later. So, yes.
Thank you. We go to slide 44, which is part of your trial demonstratives. In the second bullet point, I'm just raising my voice because of the lawnmower. In the second bullet point, you say the result is to attribute a large portion of these expenses to park, fish and game and other excluded categories, and the result, and that's your suggestion that he improperly labels certain resource expenses as overhead. I'm just trying to put the context of where we're at. And when you talk about the discrepancies in this slide between yourself and Mr. Hutchins, you're recording those discrepancies in province-wide amounts adjusted to present value. Is that correct?
Well, in this slide, there are no amounts. Later on, I do discuss those amounts as you describe them.
No, I'm sorry, but the large amounts that you go on to discuss are in province-wide amounts.
Well,
You made that clear yesterday, I thought.
Here on slide 44, I think you're asking about the phrase, a large portion of these expenses. Portion would mean share or percentage. And those percentages could be applied to the province-wide accounts or to the bottom line treaty NCR accounts. It would have the same, it'd be the same percentage, therefore it would have the same proportional effect.
Do you agree, sir, that Mr. Hutchins' actual treatment of overhead expenses does not support a conclusion that he attributes any relevant expenses of any significant amount, bottom line, to excluded categories? Would you agree with that?
Well, I think I would not, because the specific items that are listed on this slide 44, I regard as not being overhead, whereas they're so labeled in Mr. Hutchins' work papers. The impact of labeling something overhead is to exclude a portion of it. So I stand by my statement.
I think I understand. Might it be fair to say this, that your comment and your concern really boils down to a difference between your approach and Mr. Hutchins' approach as to what is considered to be relevant? Is that fair?
In this case, I think it's more accurate to say it's a difference of opinion on what is to be considered overhead.
Let's turn to slide 58. In slide 58, you indicate towards the bottom, services, I want to talk about services to mining, assays, diamond drilling, laboratories. You talk about Mr. Hutchings does include the associated gross revenue. And your complaint is, well, but he doesn't take in the associated expense. Is that a fair statement of your concern?
Not entirely. I believe the expenses should be included. I also note that in excluding the expenses, he did not exclude the associated revenue.
Okay. Now, your comment about diamond drilling in laboratories, I don't believe is in any of your reports. So that's a new concern, as far as I understand. So one might ask this question, or put it this way. I could not find any diamond drilling revenues in the RST area that Mr. Hutchings took into account. Did you?
Am I allowed to respond to the first statement you made, or is that not permitted?
No, just any responsive answer that helps the court is what we're looking for.
In our nominal values report, we did discuss this category of expenses and noted as a difference between ourselves and Mr. Hutchings. I don't believe we ever referred to diamond drilling as one component of that. It was never explicitly stated, but we talked about this general category.
Okay.
Services to mining.
And thank you for that. Now, I'm going to put it to you that Mr. Hutchings, nowhere in his work papers does he include in any revenues from diamond drilling. Would you agree with that?
If that is the case, then I was mistaken in saying he included. A clear implication of the statement on this slide we're now displaying from my demonstratives is that he included diamond drilling revenues. If you tell me it's not the case, and you're right, then that would be deceptive. I feel more certain in my belief that he did include revenues of the assay office, which is also referred to in the statement associated gross revenue.
We'll get to that in a moment, but let's stick with laboratories. And I'm going to submit to you that Mr. Hutchings took into account no revenues from laboratories. Would you agree with that?
I believe so, yes. Oh,
You agree with me?
oh no. I don't believe that to be true. I believe he included those revenues.
Are you able to point out where he took into account those revenues?
I reached the conclusion that I'm describing here by reviewing the detailed revenue work papers Mr. Hutchings submitted last March.
Can you point to anything for the court?
I cannot right now, and I will qualify my belief in this regard by saying I never documented that. The work papers are very hard to read. I believe that he did include those revenues. It is possible that on reviewing them and finding he'd included the assay office revenues, I then extrapolated in my mind to include all of these categories, but I stand by the statement that he does include some associated gross revenue.
And
Sorry,
let's,
some, what revenue?
Some, quoting from my own slide, some, quote, associated gross revenue.
Thank you.
let's talk about assays. I'm going to put to you that Mr. Hutchings does not include any revenues from assays. Would you agree with that?
I don't agree.
can we pull up page 29 of 127 of Mr. Hutchins' report? I believe it's his main report. Sorry. Ms. Lewis will help us with what exhibit number this is. Exhibit 8. Yes, thank you. Here's what Mr. Hutchins says at footnote 56 on page 29 of 127 of Exhibit 8. Ontario also collected assay fees, but because I lack data to geographically allocate such data to RST, and because the services provided by the provincial labs are not in service of a particular resource-related revenue, but akin to a fee-for-service, I do not include them in my analysis. Are you suggesting to me he's wrong?
That statement is inconsistent with what I inferred by reading his work papers.
Okay. A moment, I'll be right with you. On May 17th, I took a note that you had gave the following answer, I think in direct. And I just wanted to clear it up. I think you maybe have inadvertently made a mistake, but I'll let you help me out. The question put to you was, thank you. You just mentioned a transfer programs. Can you explain to the court what those are? Answer. Perhaps through an example, one key transfer program in Canada is the equalization program, under which the federal government pays annual transfers to many of the provinces. Parallel transfers are paid to the territories, called territorial formula financing. In each of these cases, the federal government's job is to estimate the revenues that provincial and territorial governments receive from resource revenues and income tax revenues and other sources, and then determine a way of sharing those revenues across all governments in Canada. And I'm going to suggest to you that the equalization program does not result in provincial revenues being shared amongst the governments of Canada. Would you agree?
I don't, but I do acknowledge that there's a great debate over how we should think of the equalization program in Canada. But I stand by the interpretation I offered.
Oh, I thought it was perhaps an innocent mistake, but so what you're saying is we can't simply rely on the legislation that identifies that the money comes from the federal government, not from the province, but we have to look through the legislation and look to reality, I think is what you're saying.
Are you asking me to comment on?
Yeah, I'm asking you to comment on that. I want to clear this up.
The money does, the amounts of the transfers are paid from the Consolidated Revenue Fund of the Government of Canada.
Yes.
And if anyone in the province of Alberta is listening to me, they should know that. I agree that there is some confusion on that matter among some people. But the amounts that are paid are proportional to, strictly proportional, but they take into account the amounts of the revenues of the provinces, including their resource revenues. And a useful economic interpretation of the program is that it's a way of sharing through the federal government the resource revenues of the provinces across the country.
But you do appreciate that this is a hot button topic in federal provincial relations, because the provinces, some of the provinces argue and say to the other provinces, we're just getting money from the federal government. We're not taking it from your pocket. This debate goes on, does it not?
Yes.
And really what you're saying is that, come on, let's call a spade a spade. Let's look at reality. And in truth, what's happening here is a sharing of resource revenues, correct?
Yes, I didn't use those words, but I don't reject those words.
Okay. I want to ask about a hypothetical, if I might. Can you please assume that there was a treaty obligation in 1850 that required the Crown to periodically engage in a process in consultation with the First Nation treaty parties to determine the amount of net Crown resource-based revenues? Could you just assume that?
Oh, yes, I will.
Now, does economics and your knowledge of Ontario public economics tell you that the periods to be considered in such a obligation would be annual periods coinciding with the province's fiscal years?
I have thought about this question, and I don't believe one could unambiguously draw the conclusion that periodically means once per year or once per fiscal year. Periodically, as it's commonly used by people like me, could be a different periodicity.
So I'm asking from an economics perspective. Would it make sense to do it on a fiscal year?
Economists do calculations and consultations over calculations with different periodicities, sometimes monthly, sometimes yearly. The program that you just asked me about in the previous section is reviewed every 5 years, for example.
Okay. You wouldn't feel comfortable as an economist saying that fiscal years make good sense to do it on fiscal years. You don't feel that you can offer that opinion?
It makes good sense, but not unambiguously the only good sense.
All right, thank you, sir. Another hypothetical, which is built on the last one, I want you to still assume that there's a requirement to engage in a process. Now, let's also assume that not only there was a requirement to engage in that process, but the Anishinaabe lost that opportunity to engage in the process to determine the amount of net Crown resource-based revenues in whatever period it is, whether it's annually or not annually. Okay?
Yes.
I want you to assume that they lost that. Third thing I want you to assume is that the judge in this case decides that she wants to put a value on that lost opportunity. Okay? And so my question is, with those hypotheticals I put to you, would you agree with me that the lost opportunity to influence what the net Crown resource-based revenues were to be is different than the aggregation of the NCRRs over each period being considered?
I'm going to suggest that you're asking me, what is the value of the opportunity to consult independent of the NCRs themselves?
Yeah. Is there an economic answer to that, in your view?
Not a simple one, but I think there's some economic insights on that question, and I'll be brief if I may. Economists believe that information is valuable if you can act on it. If knowing something would cause you to change your decisions in some situation, and that would make you better off, or could possibly make you better off. And so in evaluating the economic value of the opportunity to consult and to learn from that, we would ask, well, what could change? How could those agents act on that? In this case, I imagine the main benefit of consultation would be to influence the policy choices associated and therefore possibly change the path of NCRs. So I think a simple economic approach would be to value the opportunity to consult only if one felt it could lead to a change in the Crown's policy decisions around NCRs.
That's something we couldn't know. Is that what you're saying?
It would require forming an opinion on whether that consultation could have led the Crown to make different policy choices.
All right. So all you can say is that it's a fact, something you'd have to consider, but you can't go beyond that.
I think I did go beyond that in my previous answer.
Okay. Now, in parts of your slides, excuse me, you report your results on a per capita basis. Do you remember?
Yes, could
Towards
you
the
give me a
end?
slide reference?
Try.
Or if it's not, if we're not going to talk about
I think
it.
it's towards the end.
Yes, it is.
Take a look at slide 146, for example.
I have it. Thank you.
So you appreciate that the collective annuity is a collective entitlement, not an individual entitlement. Do you know that?
Yes,
And so expressing it as a per annuity recipient is it's not fair to do that, is it? I mean, aren't you trying to, like, I get the sense that what you're trying to communicate to the court is, oh my gosh, look how big it is. There's something wrong with it. Were you trying to do that?
I was trying to put big numbers in context. Sometimes it's useful to compare one number to another number. That's what a ratio does. Compares, is this number, how big is this number relative to this other number? So I do think that because the numbers in this case are large, we should try to seek ways that our understanding, the ability of normal people to understand numbers, can be put in context. That's what I think these ratios do.
Have you, I mean, do you have any idea what the wealth of Canada as a nation is? Like with all of its natural resources, all of its benefits and.
If I thought for some minutes, I could come up with estimates of the net financial worth of Canadians. There also exist other estimates of the stocks of natural resources and other assets in the economy, but those numbers don't come immediately to mind.
But economists don't usually express the wealth of a nation as, look how much value, look what each Canadian has. We don't do, economists don't do that, do they?
Well, we frequently present such numbers in per capita terms. GDP per capita, that's not wealth, that's income.
No, I appreciate that. We're talking about wealth here. Right? I mean, it's kind of a metric that's kind of misleading because the wealth of the nation belongs to the nation, not to any individual. And there's a lot, would you agree with that?
Most of the wealth of a nation does belong to individuals. So I don't think I agree.
Okay.
I'm trying to be helpful. I really am.
Look, maybe I can try it this way. To suggest that, sorry, let's go with your point for a moment. You say most of the wealth of the nation is concentrated in the hands of the very few. Maybe the children of the railroad barons from the 1860s and 70s, perhaps, or perhaps the children of other people who who were the owners of Falconbridge Mines or Inco. Perhaps they have the wealth of Canada. Is that what you meant?
It's not what I meant to suggest. I meant to suggest most wealth is private property, so it belongs to some individual or corporation. But it is very unequally distributed as well.
Right. But what I was talking about is not the wealth of the nation in private hands. I'm talking about the wealth of Canada as a nation.
Yes.
That is not in the hands of individuals, but is common to all of us. And you wouldn't describe that wealth as belonging to individuals, because that would give no solace at all to someone living on the poverty line to suggest that they, on average, have $65,000 in their pockets. It's just a metric that just seems to be inflammatory, and I wonder if you would agree with that.
I didn't intend it to be inflammatory.
Would you agree with me that the way you presented it assumes that 100% of the amounts would be paid out to individuals?
I didn't intend to indicate that either.
Can we turn for a moment, and I'm actually almost done. If we could turn to your copy of the Vidal Anderson report. Excuse me for a moment. Maybe we'll just use the one in the compendium.
I have a copy of my version if you wish it.
Well, you can look on your copy and I'll look on the version in the compendium that, what's that? Oh, okay, we can look at, if Ms. Lewis can bring it up, we can use your version because you're more comfortable using that version.
It is a bit harder to read, but yeah.
All right, and I wanted to go to the section that you referred to, that you relied on in your testimony. And you'll have to remind me that I believe it's the section that said, should it be deemed inexpedient? I believe it's on page 10 or 11 of your document. Remember, this is there we go. So we're just looking at this exhibit or this document, and I want to point out to you, you cited or relied on the latter part of the quote, but I want to read the first part of the quote. It says, Vidal and Anderson say, should it be deemed inexpedient or found impracticable to obtain the surrender of the whole territory. That's the precondition. What they're musing here is, this is what should happen if there was no treaty. You understand that, do you?
Can you tell me where it is in
Your Honor,
It's on electronic page 14 of. Sorry. It's on page 11, is it? And I understand that there were some pagination problems with this document, if you might remember.
okay.
Another
11
place,
11 of the compendium?
no, that's 11 of which exhibit? 11 of exhibit 69.
Thank you.
You can also find that passage at compendium page 69, which is quite coincidental. At the top.
Thank you. Okay. I'm sorry you asked a question.
Yes, so my question was was that the conditional subclause is, should it be deemed inexpedient or found impractical to obtain the surrender of the whole territory, comma, and then Vidal and Anderson have a comment. And so their comment about what should happen is based on, here's what should happen if we don't get a treaty for the surrender of the territory. You understand that?
I don't, that's not my interpretation, and I would like to explain why, based on the broader context of this quote, I infer differently. I don't think ultimately will change the relevance of the subsequent clause to how we should compute augmentation, but I believe, should it be deemed inexpedient, to obtain the surrender means if you can't pay upfront for whatever territory you acquire through treaty, then if, so in other words, right, so obtain the surrender, because the previous two paragraphs were about, it's difficult to know what to pay upfront. I interpreted that obtain the surrender meaning through a single upfront payment.
All right, let me ask you a hypothetical then. If the judge were to decide that that subclause is conditional and it really means that Vidal and Anderson were intending to say, here's how you might deal with things if you can't get a treaty. Would that change your opinion in this case at all?
No,
Why not?
in that hypothetical, two things are hypothetical. The treaty wasn't signed and that this clause means what to do if a treaty isn't signed. Then we would be in a wait and see world
Yes,
because in the absence, so again, right, hypothetically, there'd be no treaty, there'd be no crown claim to the lands, but still there would be crown NCRs.
how would there be crown NCRs?
Well, because we know that the crown illegally collected, I should not say illegally, it's not my job, but we know that the
I'm
crown had
comfortable with
received
that.
some. But I'm glad we could agree. We know the crown received some NCRs before the treaty in 1850. And so extending that logic, if the treaty had not been signed, one may imagine hypothetically, the crown would continue to collect NCRs. And we would therefore be in a wait and see world.
But in that wait and see world, suppose that the crown understood, and you can accept this as a hypothetical. The crown understood that they had an obligation to turn over 100% of those proceeds to the Anishinaabe. Would that change your opinion?
I feel the hypotheticals are mounting up and I want to
That's what
Put-
lawyers do.
put a stop to it. In this hypothetical situation, this paragraph gives a recommendation on how to proceed. And that recommendation is not to pay all of those funds out. Regardless of whether it's a treaty or not, it clearly recommends a different approach, and that is our Vidal Anderson approach.
It doesn't say anything about NCRRs, does it?
Will you allow me a minute? So it does, because it says in the fourth line of that paragraph, proceeds of sales.
So you think the proceeds of sales is restricted to NCRRs because that's what Vidal and Anderson said?
Yes. Proceeds of sales means, in this context, it means the revenue the crown would receive by selling what was deemed to be crown land in this hypothetical situation.
And okay,
I just have one question arising from that. Let me go. In your I'm just trying to go back to the phrase you used, regardless of whether there was a treaty or not. Here it is. You say that Vidal and Anderson are making a recommendation on how to pay. And then you say, regardless of whether there was a treaty or not. Does it say anywhere in here, regardless of whether it's a treaty or not? Don't they start by saying, if you can't get a treaty?
I don't feel they do, Your Honor. That was a hypothetical posed to me.
No, well, I'm going to go back to not hypothetical.
Yeah.
So looking at the top of page 6, I'm using the compendium and I'm at the top of page 69. I don't think there's any quarrel about these words.
Should it be deemed?
Should it be deemed expedient or
inexpedient.
inexpedient or found impractical to obtain the surrender? I'm going to call that getting a treaty. the only alternative would appear to be investment of the proceeds of sales. And you say that that's a suggestion on how to deal with any revenues, regardless of whether there's a treaty or not. Is there something I'm missing in there? It appears to me, it's only, if you can't get a treaty, try this.
Well, Your Honor, that is not my opinion. And I just want to be clear that my opinion about what that phrase means is different.
Okay, and does your opinion come from anywhere other than that, than those lines?
Yes, it's the context of the prior two paragraphs, which are discussing the difficulty in ascertaining the value of the territory and the issue of just how much territory should be acquired from treaty.
Right.
And so I think that perhaps obtain the surrender means pay up front for the treaty, because that's what was being discussed in the prior paragraph. I do also think it's possible that the issue is that whether the treaty would involve the surrender of the whole territory being discussed or only a portion of it.
Mhm.
The third possibility is the interpretation that Mr. Schachter proposed, which is that if the treaty breaks down, if the process breaks down and there is no treaty, what to happen? I don't believe that's correct. But if hypothetically, I mean, if Mr. Schachter is right, that this paragraph is about what to do if there is no treaty,
Mhm.
which I do not accept, I think that the information that follows is still relevant to Your Honor's decision-making here today, because it's about what should be done on a wait and see basis with NCRs in the future.
Thank you.
Just a few more questions and then we'll be done. Are we doing okay? Okay. Just want to go through a couple of things in your slide deck. When you were discussing, let's go to 20 of 161. I had recollected from my notes that when you were discussing the estimates of the results, and you referenced Mr. Hutchings, at Mr. Hutchings' interest rate, you were talking about his 56,899,000,000. And I had thought I heard you say that the nominal amount is about 10% of that.
I feel we discussed this and that I was corrected. Didn't you direct me before to think of this as 99% interest instead of 90%
No,
interest?
When you said, I thought your evidence was that the nominal amount of 56,899,000,000 is about 10% of that. And
Just to clarify, do you agree this amount is not a nominal, but a present value amount?
yeah, yes.
Okay.
But I thought there was just a slip, an innocent error that you said 10% when you meant it's probably closer to around $1 billion, because when you look at Mr. Hutchings' figures, that's what he says it is. He says the nominal amount is about $1 billion over the years.
Yes,
Would you agree with that?
I believe you pointed me to that table in his report. So it was $1 billion, which would imply this amount, present value, is 98% interest. In saying somewhat off the cuff, it's around 90% interest. I was not as accurate as I would have wished.
Okay. Over on slide 53, you talk about air service. And what this amounts to, you would agree, is that you and Mr. Hutchings have a difference of opinion about what percentage of air service to be included?
Yes.
If you could go to page 77 of your slides of 161.
Yes.
Is it fair to say that you and Mr. Hutchings have a difference of opinion about the spending on the Northern Roads program?
In this case, I believe that Mr. Hutchings made statements about our approach which were factually incorrect.
So you don't think that he could hold that opinion that you were incorrect? You think that he made some sort of mathematical error? Or you just disagree that with his conclusion? I mean, it's a matter, I'm trying to understand whether it's a matter of difference of opinion
Yep.
or whether you want to demonstrate here for the judge that he made a mathematical error in the way that I was going to show you about the double counting, how it was a mathematical thing.
I made mathematical errors such as double counting. One may, and Mr. Hutchings did too. That's fine. This is different. I simply wanted to make clear that when Mr. Hutchings stated we included Northern Roads spending in the period from 1978 to 1986, that statement was factually incorrect.
Oh, okay. And are you able to demonstrate that for the judge right here and now that he made a mistake?
Well,
Or we'll just have to take your word for it at this point?
that's in my slides 78 through 85, which we went through in examination.
Okay, so that's where, okay. I have run out of any questions, and I wanted to thank you for your time and attention. And I believe that you're going to have some questions put to you by a couple other lawyers yet. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes my questions.
Thank you very much. How are we doing on time? 12:06.
Good afternoon, Professor Smart.
Good afternoon.
I don't know if we've formally met before. My name is Spencer Bass. I'm counsel for 7 of the plaintiff First Nations in this case. And I do have some questions for you this afternoon. I will hope not to keep everyone too long from their weekend.
And in that hope, please remember to leave a space of 2 beats between the end of an answer and the new question.
I will certainly try,
Thank you.
and I'm sure Your Honor will remind me if I forget.
Go ahead.
So Professor Smart, just before we get started, I just wanted to indicate that I will likely be asking you to refer to a few documents, namely your reports that you co-authored with Professor Bodway, as well as your slide deck of demonstratives. Do you have those with you?
Yes.
There. Okay, so those will be the main things that I'll be asking you to refer to. I may also ask you to refer to a few documents that I may provide you with during the course of the examination. And so the first area that I wanted to ask you some questions about are about Fish and Game. And as I understand it, you don't calculate revenues from fish and game from the territories in your NCRR calculations. Is that correct?
That's right.
And to be fair, it's your understanding that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings don't calculate those revenues either.
Yes.
And despite the fact that you don't include revenues from fish and game, you do make the point at paragraph 35 of your nominal values report that the revenues from the Lake Superior fisheries were not insignificant in some years. Do you recall that
Yes.
statement? If you would like to go to paragraph
No.
35 to double check, you can.
I'm sorry, you might not have heard. I answered yes.
Yes. That's fine, but I saw that you were flipping through the report. We can go to paragraph 35. And the government may collect revenues from the fishing industry, both directly through licensing fees, and it may also receive indirect revenues through, for example, taxes on fishing companies, fishermen, and the sales of fish.
I haven't reviewed the revenue instruments the Crown used in any detail because of our decision not to include them.
That's fair, but you do accept that the Crown may have indeed collected revenues from such activities.
Yes.
And as I read from your report, one of the main reasons that you provide for not including and not calculating these revenues is because the plaintiff's experts similarly did not include them. Is that accurate?
Yes, I gave 2 reasons and that was one of them.
And I believe one of the other reasons that you gave was that you didn't receive specific instructions from counsel from Ontario to include them.
I don't recall saying that, but that's true.
And so it is possible that your NCRR calculations could have been different had you included fishing revenues.
Yes.
Another category of expenses that you included from your NCRR calculations were expenses for parks, conservation, flood control, and northern development programs.
I heard you say included, but
Excluded. If I said included, that was my mistake. You excluded those expenses. You did not count them in your NCRR calculations.
that's correct.
And still at paragraph 35 of your nominal values report, which is it's a lengthy paragraph with a number of sub bullets, but I'm looking at the, I guess, the second sub bullet on the top of page 16. That's where you discuss these expenses. You see that?
Which expenses?
Expenses on
Yes.
provincial parks, local
Understood.
conservation authorities. And you note at this, in this sub bullet, that while resource companies do derive some benefits from such expenditures, their objectives are far broader, and we conservatively exclude them entirely from our analysis. That's what you wrote?
Yes.
And so you do accept that where certain expenditures have objectives that are broader than benefiting resource companies, these expenses should not be included in calculating NCRRs.
No, I don't accept that in general. The point here is different. We exclude northern development programs. Resource companies would have been beneficiaries of those programs in some degree. We note that that's the case, but because the intent, the main focus of these programs was on something else, because of the impossibility in practice of computing how much of those northern development programs assisted resource rents, the impracticality of estimating that, we excluded all such expenditures. So I hope that helps.
And so Similarly, resource companies in the RST area may receive benefits from the government's flood control programs.
Yes, I think probably true.
But you accept that the objectives of such flood control programs were not solely to assist those resource companies.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons why you exclude those expenses from your analysis.
The issue here is one of the practicality of estimating any such benefits. In those cases, it's not practical to do so.
And yet you do include expenses in your analysis for things like fire control and railway subsidies.
Yes,
And you would accept that these expenses also have objectives that are broader than just benefiting resource companies.
yes,
And I believe you spoke about some of them before in your testimony. For example, for fire control, one of the objectives, one of the benefits is protecting communities from wildfires.
I don't recall speaking about that, but I agree. That's a benefit of fire control.
One of the benefits of the railways would be to allow people to more easily travel across the country on passenger railways.
Yes, I spoke about that.
And I'm going to suggest to you, sir, that it's inconsistent in your approach to exclude some expenses because they have broader objectives like flood control, but include others that similarly have these broad objectives like fire control and railway subsidies. Do you disagree?
I disagree. If I can expand briefly, I tried to describe our method here. We asked the question, but for the resource objectives, excuse me, no, it's better to think of it the other way. But for the non-resource objectives, would spending have been substantially different? If so, we did not include all of the expense, particularly in the case of railways. Mr. Basta, want to make sure that you know we didn't include all of the railway subsidies, but only a portion of about 25% of them, based on precisely the principle I just described.
And I believe in your testimony last Wednesday, as another way of describing that analysis that you just described, you discussed it as you made these determinations based on your own sense of the importance of the other Crown objectives, the non-resource objectives of the Crown?
Yes, in the way I just described in my prior answer.
That's what you meant by determining your own sense of the importance of the other Crown objectives. It was your but-for analysis.
Yes.
And this analysis is based on your opinion or your beliefs about what Crown policy makers would have done in the past.
No.
So perhaps I can rephrase that. It's based on your opinion of what Crown policymakers might have done in the past, given a different situation. So given that there weren't resource revenues in the territory, what might they have done with these expenses?
Again, as in my previous answer, I think it's more useful to think about a but-for analysis in which the Crown chose spending in the absence of those other non-resource benefits. What would be different?
And reasonable people could disagree on that but-for analysis?
The answer to that would depend on the context, what the reasonable people knew.
And we can't know for certain what Crown policymakers would have actually done in the past had certain circumstances been different. So for example, we can't know for certain if they would have spent a different amount on fire protection if there was no timber industry in the RST.
No, we can't.
I want to talk a little bit about the expenses for colonization roads. And again, this is one of the areas where you include a portion of the expenses in your analysis. Is that right?
Yes,
And that's because of the result of your but-for analysis when you applied it to colonization roads.
yes,
And so you needed to determine a proportion or a method of allocation for the percentage of colonization road expenses that you are going to include. Is that fair?
yes,
But you didn't have any actual data on what proportion of long distance road traffic was related to resource extraction.
if by data you mean a specific table of numbers, such as the ones we've been reviewing in such detail, no. If data is interpreted to mean information, of course, I've read many documents related to the way in which roads were used and the objectives that Crown had in mind when it built those roads.
And so your solution was to simply apply the percentage that you calculated for railway expenses to long distance road expenses.
Yes, that was based on my sense that in the period that we studied before the advent of the motor car in Northern Ontario, roads, long distance roads were used in very similar ways to the railways. And they carried in roughly the same proportion resource traffic as opposed to passenger traffic.
And as you just mentioned, though, you didn't have any actual numerical data or statistics that the breakdown of uses on the roads was even broadly similar to the uses of railways.
No,
So I'm going to suggest to you, sir, that when it comes to the road expenses, this percentage that you applied was arbitrary.
I don't agree it's arbitrary, but it's not as well supported by the data as I would say it is in the case of railways.
You signed an acknowledgement of expert duty for your role in this case?
Yes.
Father? And you understand that your role as an expert here is to assist the court?
Yes,
You're not an advocate for any side in the dispute?
no,
Your role is not to ensure that the net Crown resource revenues are as low as possible,
no,
even if that outcome might be one that the government of Ontario would prefer in this litigation. That's not your role.
honestly, I don't think any of the lawyers in this case like me very much.
Well, I will not comment on that. So I want to talk about railway expenses. And as you mentioned in your testimony, in order to determine the proportion of railway expenses to include, you estimated the percentage of railway revenues that related to resource products. Is that a fair characterization of what you did?
Yes,
And after you did these calculations in your initial reports, you determined that the estimated share of railway earnings that was referable to resource products was 29.8%.
yes, that's what I recall.
And so in your initial calculations, you included 29.8% of the Crown Railway expenses in your calculations.
Yes,
And when you initially determined these statistics, this percentage, you included data for the transcontinental railways. Is that right?
yes,
And if you recall, in his reply report, Mr. Hutchings pointed out a transcription error in the statistics that you used for the Canadian Pacific Railway. Do you recall that?
Yes,
And you acknowledge that this transcription error did in fact occur?
yes,
And according to what Mr. Hutchings wrote in the reply report, the impact of correcting this transcription error would be to decrease the percentage of railway earnings from resource products from the 29.8% that you had calculated down to 21.6%. Is that right?
I don't recall that, but the direction is exactly right.
Well, so let's take a look at your reply report to Mr. Hutchings, paragraph 47. So I'm just. So there were two reply reports. So just the one that was the reply report to
And the court
Mr.
file
Hutchings
number.
is the one that I'm referring to.
You want the court file number?
Or the exhibit number? Should be exhibit.
It should be exhibit 63. And so I'm looking at paragraph 47 of the report. Let me know when you're there.
I'm there.
And paragraph 47, you discussed the issue of this transcription error that we were just discussing. Is that right?
Yes,
Glad we are all on the same page here. That's great. And at the bottom of this paragraph, you write that Mr. Hutchings notes that correcting the transcription error would cause the estimated share of resource products in railway earnings to fall from the previously reported 29.8% to 21.6%. See that?
yes,
And so applying the correction that Mr. Hutchings indicates here, that would decrease the amount of expenses from railways that you include in your NCRR calculations.
if we were to lower the percentage, then the expenses go down. Yes,
And as we just discussed, because you use the same percentage for colonization road expenses, if you had made that change, it would similarly decrease the amount of included expenses for the colonization roads.
yes,
And so in response to Mr. Hutchings pointing out this transcription error, you didn't just change your numbers as Mr. Hutchings suggested. Instead, what you did is you went back to your model and you said, to paraphrase a little bit, wait a minute, the transcontinental railways, like the Canadian Pacific Railway, should not have been included in our calculations in the first place because their statistics are for the whole country, not just the Robinson Superior Treaty area. Is that a fair summary of your response?
yeah, that's exactly right. I hadn't reviewed this portion of my calculations in sufficient detail. I didn't detect the transcription error, or indeed the fact that we were including nationwide statistics for the Canadian Pacific and the other transcontinentals in this question of, well, how much of the traffic on the railway is resource products? Our Northern Ontario resource products of mines and wood. So when you look at the Canadian Pacific, of course, they were carrying a lot of grain and there are a lot of passengers across Western Canada at that period of time, 1919. So having that called to my attention by Mr. Hutchings' reply report, I changed my opinion over how to do this.
And in changing your opinion, what you did was you removed the data from the transcontinental railways and calculating the expense proportion for railway expenses.
Yes,
And that, of course, had the effect of dealing with the transcription error because you don't use the Canadian Pacific Railway data at all anymore.
right.
And so to talk about the effect of this change by making this change and excluding the transcontinental railway data, your percentage for railway expenses it drops from 29.8% to 26.9%. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so,
Wait, I actually don't think that's correct. Could you repeat the
yeah,
question?
so I had said from 29.8%, which was your original number, to 26.9%, which is your new number. And perhaps looking at paragraph 48, the next paragraph of your SIR reply report might assist you.
I'm going to reference my slides.
If it helps, I believe it was slide 101.
You are correct. Go ahead.
I'm just correct on this slide, or I'm correct on the percentage number as well?
You're correct on everything so far.
Perhaps I should stop while I'm ahead then. I do have some more questions. So in your final calculation numbers before the court now, you use the 26.9% as the proportion of included railway expenses.
Yes,
And that's instead of the 21.6% that Mr. Hutchings had identified would be the result of correcting the transcription error.
yes. And I think really, if anything, we use too small a share. I think the data in table 4 in the SIR reply makes clear to you that not only am I not cherry picking in choosing that number, I've really chosen too low a number.
Well, let's step back and discuss that for a second. So when you included the data from the transcontinental railways, the effect of doing so was that your proportion of included expenses was around 30%, right?
Yes,
But then when you realize the transcription error and you realize that the percentage of included expenses would actually be lower, around 21 or 22% when you included these railways, all of a sudden you decided that the transcontinental railway data should be excluded.
that's an accurate description of the sequence of things that happened, but not what was in my mind.
And rather than just correct the transcription error, as Mr. Hutchings suggested, and drop the included expenses down to around 21%, 22%, you instead decided to exclude the transcontinental railway data altogether.
Yes, while including the Canadian Northern Ontario, which despite its name, didn't operate only in Northern Ontario. It operated trackage from Ottawa to Port Arthur, and I think by 1919, the year in question, all the way to the Manitoba border, and importantly, tracked from Sudbury to Toronto, which was previously called the James Bay Railway, but was by then incorporated into the Canadian Northern Ontario. You'll notice that it was a really big railway compared to the others, so it has a very big weight in the average, and that very big weight reflects the traffic it was carrying in Southern Ontario and Eastern Ontario. And in that sense, I believe that the number that I chose is actually too small to represent trackage, freight shares in Northern Ontario.
And to go back to the bottom line though, the effect of your approach, as opposed to the approach that Mr. Hutchings suggested for correcting the transcription error, is to lower the net Crown resource revenues.
I'm sorry, you asked me, does including more expense from the railways lead to lower NCRs? The answer is yes.
Perhaps it was an obvious question.
No, I'm sorry.
That's fair. Oh, certainly, because we had an earlier start. Certainly, I'll just finish up this area. And so had Mr. Hutchings not identified the transcription error, it's possible that you would have maintained your inclusion of the nearly 30% of railway and colonization road expenses.
I would hope that our subsequent checks would have caught the oversight, but I don't know.
And actually, perhaps now is a good time for the lunch break.
What do you have, 12:30? What do you need, folks? What can we do? Should we? No,
That's 1:45.
1:45?
That's one.
I've heard from Mr. Rankin that there's a call that he needs to be on. Be a little bit better for him to get started. If it's possible with the time.
Is that good? How does that, yeah, how much time do you need, Mr. Bass?
Perhaps another hour and a half.
Okay.
And so I believe my understanding is that Council for Ontario yesterday had estimated about 15 to 20 minutes of reexamination. I don't know if that's changed.
We're good?
So 2 o'clock should be fine.
2 o'clock. Thank you very much.